Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Tom Rogan. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews and the full premium experience. So as we record this right now, U.S. sources are telling CNN they, quote, believe that Israel could imminently launch a more limited ground incursion into southern Lebanon than was originally planned following discussions between the two countries just this past weekend. CNN source apparently, quote, did caution that U.S. officials are concerned that what could start as a limited incursion, sort of what we're seeing now, may transition into a larger operation over a longer term. And the source also added, quote, those concerns are being discussed with the Israeli side. Imminently more limited, but also potentially larger. How do we square that circle? What does it mean? The images coming in from Lebanon are stunning. Thousands more lives are on the line, military and civilian, as is the possibility of an even wider conflict in the Middle East. For supporters of Israel, a major victory is in reach just about a year, almost to the day, on the anniversary of the October 7th attacks, allowing some 60,000 Israelis who fled the country's north amid Hezbollah's attacks after October 7th, right after October 7th, to return. That's pending right now, whether the IDF can secure a buffer zone inside Lebanese territory. And it's clear that in recent days, Hezbollah, one of Israel's strongest foes, has been nearly decimated in Lebanon. So what will come in its wake is another massive unanswered question with enormous consequences in the near term and in the long term. So joining us now to analyze this developing story is one of my very favorite journalists, Tom Rogan of the Washington Examiner. He is also one of the most well-sourced journalists in this space, period. So let's get to our interview with Tom. Tom Rogan, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with you, Emily.
Okay, so let's start with this question. What's more likely here, a sort of targeted special forces operation along the lines of what we're seeing play out right now in southern Lebanon, or something that becomes a longer, larger operation in southern Lebanon? Which do you think is more likely?
Probably somewhere in between. I think the Israelis, the strategic intent is to push Hezbollah back to a degree to which they can return Israelis to their homes in northern Israel. So that requires them to essentially hold territory in a way that...
buffer zone, right?
Exactly, in a way that would prevent at least a significant amount of Hezbollah's munitions from being able to reach into Israel. And you can't do that with special forces raids. To some degree, you would need to have a presence that can clear out specific areas of
20
launch.
miles, something like that?
20 miles, that's, roughly. I mean, it depends what they want, right? There are various ranges of munitions. But special forces raids can't accomplish that. So it will require some persistent ground presence, I would think for at least a matter of weeks, more likely months, potentially longer than that. I mean, the question becomes, though, as much as Israel has the strategic initiative at the moment and clearly has thrown the Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran off balance, I mean, in a really seismic way, once they have people on the ground there in a persistent sense, they are going to start taking casualties, maybe significant casualties, because Hezbollah knows that terrain. It's easier to move, ambush, scoot and shoot. The same way, in a sense, that the US military, for all its capacity in terms of weapons and training, suffered significant casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, the insurgent fight.
And what are your sources telling you they think something like that might look like? If Israel really goes in and tries to establish a 20-mile or roughly 20-mile buffer zone in Lebanon, there are significant casualties. What are we expecting, at least from the U.S.? A lot of people don't know. Tom is a dual citizen.
Right. Well, I think the civilian, one of the benefits of ground force operations is that, especially in terrain like that civilian casualties might actually be more limited because you're not relying wholly on air power. So you're going but it means the Israeli casualties will go up. So in a sense, there's a sort of cost translation there that moves on to the Israelis. The question is how quick can the Israelis secure the ground? Does Hezbollah stand and fight? Which I think is likely. But it's a great unknown. I mean, in 2006 and earlier, the Israelis were there for a long time, up until like 2000. But the degree to which Hezbollah has the means and will to resist and launch attacks, I think, will significantly shape how quick. Now, if Hezbollah is like, well, we've taken such a hammer blow, let's just basically, without admitting as much, cede that ground, then it'll be very quick. Clearly, that's what the Israelis want. That's why they've been doing all these pager attacks, airstrikes, killing Nasrallah, because they want to impose such a sharp, jugular punch to Hezbollah that essentially Hezbollah says, you know what, let them have this one and we'll reconstitute. But if Hezbollah does that, they look weaker, their ability to impose costs on Israel is significantly degraded. So it's, basically, I think, how much willingness does Hezbollah have to, conduct operations in that area?
And that was actually going to be my next question for you. So that's interesting. Pagers, walkie-talkies, Tehran, all of this paves the ground for potentially going and establishing the buffer zone, allowing 60,000 Israelis who have fled northern Israel to go back into their homes. But that question is huge, is how significantly has Hezbollah been damaged by, all those charts bopping around social media. You cover this, and you know this issue way better than I do. Are those charts that show Israel eliminating this chain of hierarchy in the Hezbollah leadership are reflective of a substantial damage to their operation?
Yes, I mean, look, Israel has wiped out essentially the senior operations command, and the impact that has on their ability to generate forces to go and do stuff is potentially very significant. They have a lot of people who've been wounded by the pager attacks, right? That can't be deployed. There'll be a lot of Hezbollah people be running scared that they're going to follow orders now because they don't want to, what might happen if they do. And that risk holding, the degree to which Israel has penetrated Hezbollah in terms of intelligence, the difficulty of knowing where so many high-level people are at so many different points and being able to eliminate them so efficiently is just like a hammer blow to the Hezbollah mindset. And so anyone, who is in the organization, let's say you're a surviving mid-ranking Hezbollah leader.
And I'm not.
You're not.
I'm not, I swear.
That we know of.
I promise.
Okay, well, you were engaged in the cigarette smuggling trade for a land
yes. But
which is what Hezbollah does in the United States. But I'm a junior person, right? Yes. And you're saying, hey, let's come in and have this meeting. Do I want to come and have this meeting with you? Because right, and that wasn't the case a month ago.
Sure.
I'm going to be there because if I'm not there, I got a prop. You're going to impose, your own consequences upon me. And so that sort of degradation of morale and confidence and capability is significant. The question is, though, once Israel starts moving ground forces in and trying to hold territory, how much do local commanders and local forces take the initiative in the way that the Taliban and different Haqqani network did in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda Iraq in Iraq, etc. Whatever group you want to have, that initiative at the lower level to go and launch your own attacks, then they can start imposing costs on the Israelis. So the question is, how much of a hammer blow is it?
Mm-hmm. And so Jared Kushner, for example, did you see his post over the weekend on X? He said something like, the Israelis have eliminated more of America's most wanted people in 2 days than the U.S. did in 20 years. I'm paraphrasing what he said there, but that was essentially the gist of it. Do you think, based on your reporting, your sourcing and everything, that's a sentiment shared among people in the United States government? One thing we've seen since the pager attacks, for example, is the Biden administration continued to at least publicly show that there is some type of daylight between them and Netanyahu, continuing to express publicly this, through leaks and otherwise, this discontent with the way that Netanyahu continues to prosecute the war. But do you get the sense that inside the U.S. government, at least this latest round of attacks on Hezbollah, the U.S. is sort of grateful for?
Yes, and legitimately to a degree, because some of the senior people just below Hezbollah who've been killed, just below Nasrallah who've been killed, are directly responsible for killing a lot of Americans. 241 Americans in the Marine barracks bombing 1983, 17 Americans at the embassy annex earlier that year. The kidnapping, grotesque torture of a CIA station chief, stuff that hasn't made the news, where they killed a lot of CIA sources, frankly, because the CIA used ridiculous tradecraft. And if you type in on Google, pizza, Beirut, CIA, they were meeting their sources at pizza restaurants.
Sounds like a great
and
Friday
Hezbollah,
night.
But there's some great reporting others have done on that. But Hezbollah has been an ardent enemy of the United States in a way that, frankly, Hamas has not been. Right, Hamas is the Israel enemy, whereas Hezbollah is both the Israel and America enemy. And so there's that satisfaction and justice, which I think is entirely legitimate. Where I think the administration, And frankly, I think they have been sort of too cautious in telling the Israelis not to take. These people should have been taken out before the United States, should say. And Biden did say, Nasrallah, there's a measure of justice here. Okay, where the distinction comes is that the U.S. does not want an Israeli offensive into southern Lebanon to create havoc in the Lebanese political structure, right? That another Lebanese civil war that causes massive casualties. The Lebanese economy is already in the toilet. Sectarian tensions are very significant. And so that sense of instability is a concern, and in quite practical sense, a concern beyond the politics, because there are a lot of U.S. Navy and Air Force assets at the higher grade, potential of being warfighting assets that are now deployed to the Middle East to try and deter Iran and manage this crisis. 2 carrier strike groups, or soon to be 2 carrier strike groups. That is taking a lot out of Pacific deterrence. If China wanted to move now, simply, I don't think they do, but simply for military means, there wouldn't be much of a better time, because so much of the US military is being moved, postured to the Middle East versus deterring China. And if people just Google China Philippines, for example, Chinese being very aggressive. The Philippines is a treaty defense ally, and that's aside from Taiwan and Japan and other factors.
So actually, on that note, just before you got here, you had finished writing about the Houthis. And so how do the Houthis factor into, let's start with China, into the distraction of resources, but how do they fit into the immediate Middle East picture right now as well?
Well, the distraction of resources, the Houthis mainly are beneficial to the Chinese because they're firing all these, crude, some are crude, some are more advanced, anti-ship missiles, drone platforms, unmanned boats, manned boats against international shipping going through the Red Sea. In the US, with some limited support from other international partners, has a program to try and stop those attacks. The problem is the Biden administration is relying almost wholly on trying to defensive measures, shooting down incoming stuff rather than taking out Houthi positions. And that is using up a lot of finite anti-air missile systems. So the kind of things the Navy would use to shoot down Chinese ballistic missiles,
in the South China
aircraft,
Sea.
exactly, or the Taiwan Strait or around the Taiwan Strait in the event of a war. And the ability to mass produce those things is not there. So you're using a lot to shoot down crude stuff. And, I think the calculation is, the Pentagon wants to be more robust in the way that the Israelis have been with the Houthis, that where they launch an attack, you don't simply take out a couple of launch platforms, you launch a much more broad attack on their port facilities, etc. But of course, some people would say, well, that's mission creep, that's another conflict that's not declared. And so, there are political complexities attuned to that.
And what are the political complexities as it pertains to the Houthis right now for Israel, for Hezbollah, for Iran?
I think the Houthis' impact on Israel and that conflict is relatively limited because it's hard for them to get missiles that far, and the Israelis shoot most of them down. We shoot a lot of them down.
Although it creates a big headache for Israel's allies, right?
It does. It creates a big headache in terms of that resourcing to try and shoot that stuff down. It's just another facet of the conflict, right? That was the Hamas attack on Israel, Israel's response to Hamas, Lebanese Hezbollah launching rockets into Israel, the Houthis launching attacks on international shipping. It's all interwoven, and so it's a continuing part of the crisis.
And let's actually talk about Iran now more specifically talk about Iran. So the Iranian reaction to what happened in Tehran, a lot of people expected that to be instantaneous and very dramatic, but now with the destruction of this Hezbollah chain of command, pager attack, and all of that, Hezbollah really being on its back foot, does this provoke a response from Iran? I don't mean to say provoke in terms of adjudicating blame, but I mean to say in terms of sort of the consequence immediately, what we can see from Iran in the next couple of days.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I actually wrote a piece after Nasrallah was killed saying, this makes a significant Iranian retaliation very likely. And it hasn't happened. So either I'm a pretty poor analyst, or the Iranian calculation, I think, is that they have suffered such a big blow here that they're really off balance. And I think Khamenei, the supreme leader, who's ultimately the kingmaker who makes the decisions on foreign policy, they will retaliate because they have to, because if they don't, their whole raison d'etre has been gutted by the Israelis, and they look weak. And again, those factors that we were talking about earlier of, do you want to communicate? Do you want to engage? Do you want to follow orders? Do you want to do something? You're not going to do it if Iran just looks totally impotent, which they look at the moment.
And is that, so the Hezbollah strikes on Tel Aviv, right? The attempts to launch, obviously they've been intercepted, but is that potentially...
Well, that's very low level scale.
It would seem to.
Right? Yeah. They're not putting everything out at once. To really accomplish a significant attack, they have to use a lot of their different missiles, drones.
Overwhelm the Iron Dome.
Exactly. Exactly. And, I think their sense is the US has a lot of assets there at the moment. They're aware the US election is coming up. They don't want Trump back in. They don't want to provoke a response from the Biden administration that would be significant. I mean, I think one of the interesting things, the Biden administration has been pretty resistant to using significant force against the Iranians so far when they've done certain things against US troops in Iraq, for example.
Does the success against Hezbollah make that look like a mistake?
What a mistake.
So the Biden America.
Oh, yeah.
The Biden administration's public stance on Israel's sort of prosecution just in the last couple of weeks.
I think so in relation to Lebanon. Clearly, the Hezbollah has been willing to, and Iran has been willing to tolerate huge seismic losses in a way that I think was not anticipated by many people. So, that is a big point. But I also think Iran ultimately will retaliate because they have to, will attempt to. The question is, though, do they respond in slightly different ways? So their level of enriched uranium at near weapons grade levels has steadily been increasing in recent months to a really concerning degree toward the so-called breakout. So they would potentially go for a nuclear weapon. Harmony might say now, okay, well, we're going to do another high enriched capacity thing here, because the Israelis would really struggle to the point of probably not being able to do it. Take out Iran's nuclear program without the US. And the US is not, I don't think, certainly under this administration, willing to do that. So that might be a way for Iran to respond without using force, but still having a significant political impact. And frankly, there would be certain people in the Biden administration who would say to the Israelis, look what you've sort of caused now, even though it's the Iranians doing it.
And the intelligence on that is good, the enriched uranium?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and
listen, I've heard about enriched uranium before.
Yeah, but open sourced. So the IAEA, it had been publicly said that they've done this. There are ways, and also terrorism, of course, right? That they can they can try and blow up Israeli diplomats somewhere, shoot Israeli tourists, which they've tried to do before. They're still trying to assassinate, Donald Trump and John Bolton and others. There are asymmetric ways for them to respond, which they would probably, I would imagine, they're trying to up at the moment.
Well, let me ask you about those. You see those as credible assassination threats?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. Well, they're trying to recruit.
It seems credible to me. I mean, the reporting seems credible to me. A lot of people on the left, though, are downplaying it as sort of the belligerent leaking of the security state.
No, they're trying to, recruit people to go and kill, Brian Hook, John Bolton, I think Milley, Trump certainly, and kind of ad hoc basis. But of course, the U.S.-Mexico border, we know a lot of terrorists have got through there. How many Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps people have got through there as well? I mean, I don't think they would necessarily use their own people to do an assassination attempt because they want a bit of deniability. But hiring people, hiring a gang member, here's go and shoot this photograph person. This is where he works. And there has been, they did, some of the stuff to do with John Bolton, for example. They knew where he worked. They would be starting to do surveillance and things. And that's why you see a lot of, security details have been assigned to these people. John Bolton, Milley, Brian Hook, have full-time security details, which is very expensive and hard to do because of limited resources, because the threat is so high.
Okay, so let's actually talk about the border, because on Friday there was a letter released that ICE had sent to an American congressman, a Republican congressman, about the level of criminals who had been currently detained, or who are currently detained, but also who are not currently detained. The numbers are in the tens of thousands, and when you break it down by particular categories, sexual assault, etc., it's truly terrifying. Murder. But I want to get a sense, and this is going to sound like a really dumb question, but how freaked out are people in the intelligence community, people you talk to in those spaces, about what might have come through the border just in the last couple of years? It seems like such an obvious threat, but we really haven't talked about it at all in the mainstream discourse.
No, extremely concerned. And I find it fascinating that there's actually not more, tends the media coverage of that. It's probably a very good example of media bias, that a lot of the media coverage on that tends to focus around, conservative news sources, but it's manifestly true. FBI, DHS, NSA, people who would have a proximate role in border security, the Border Patrol, you have essentially an open border at the south, and to a degree the Canadian border is also a big terrorist concern, that terrorists coming from Canada into the United States. And essentially the concern is, even if there are some people here, and the FBI did arrest a couple of months ago a group of ISIS Khorasan, like a cell potentially,
yes,
in raids, and they were in different cities. They had moved to different cities. One link that that is deeply concerning. How many? And essentially, if you are, know how to, if you're not on your cell phone, you're not Googling how to make a bomb. If you come in with tradecraft, how to avoid detection, and you're not running around screaming Allahu Akbar, you might be able to evade the FBI and then launch an attack. Right.
Yeah.
And so, various terrorist groups, how many Lebanese Hezbollah have come in? And so, it's a very significant concern. And, it's just one of those sort of fingers crossed things that, you can catch them.
So square this circle for me. Why have the hawks in the Biden administration, or even just who work at the Pentagon, for example, not been able to get their way at the border? Is it just that as a priority, immigration is so strong for elected Democrats, they don't want to have to water down their immigration policy in substance, even if they do publicly?
I think that's the only plausible explanation.
It's very bizarre.
Because it's insane.
But what's the explanation for why they let Rob Malley, who has obviously been accused of... it doesn't make sense either, that they let Rob Malley continue to get confidential information because they didn't want, the public embarrassment?
Yeah. Well, it's politics.
And he had been passing information to Iranian sources?
Yeah. Well, I think it's unclear what exactly he did, but the slow rolling of that investigation and the degree to which the administration has been loath to be open about these concerns and address them. I mean, the border one, though, is particularly egregious, sort of beggars belief, and is, I think, deeply undercutting of the idea, this is the adults in charge per se. But it's... from my point of view, what I find really strange about the border situation in particular is that even if the White House thought, right, there is a political incentive here to keep, Democrats happy, it helps in whatever way, what happens if a group of ISIS terrorists go and shoot up a mall or a school or something, and they would shoot up a school, by the way, if they could, on October 15th? That might not be a great ingredient for Kamala Harris's re-election campaign, based on Trump's, and so you would think
obvious.
It seems so obvious, but I think again that the sentiment is just fingers crossed nothing happens, and that we can catch people. But the fact there have been relatively few terrorism, they caught that one cell. There are a lot of others under surveillance, is I think concerning in of itself, because it would suggest that there are people who are essentially unknowns out there. And if you talk to people who work in these organizations, they say, yeah, there are definitely people we don't know where they are and what they might be doing, but they are terrorists.
That's good. Yeah, that's comforting. So what I'm trying to get at with that question is squaring the circle of what the left says about the Biden administration, what the right says about the Biden administration. The left says the Biden administration is hawkish and belligerent towards Iran. The right says the Biden administration is utterly ideologically and in some cases personally captured by Iran. And it just sort of comparing both of those two stances. I mean, they're unreconcilable stances, but how do you see it as an analyst in that space?
What I find fascinating, and I don't think gets nearly enough attention, is how Trump particularly is obsessed with this deal-making narrative. You see it with Zelensky and Putin, but he also says it about Iran, that it would be maximum strategy and he would be friends with Iran if they came in. Right, and he's still right. He still says it, even though they're trying to kill him. So what his policy might look like, is I think unclear. But the Biden administration is really the continuation of the Obama administration's obsession with the nuclear accord, and rapprochement with Iran and trying to find a new way of dealing. But clearly, in terms of how Iran has been thrown off balance by the Israelis, I think there's an indication there that they haven't used enough strength to impose costs on Iran, in terms of their activities. I mean, the fact that Iran is trying to kill a major presidential candidate, a former president, is in and of itself, an outrage. And frankly, I would think in previous administrations you would have seen, limited airstrikes against the people trying to plot that. But that hasn't happened. I think they, are captured by this fear of escalation, but also by their belief that somehow they can create a new relationship with Iran, and they're beholden to it. And I don't think at a certain level that's their political bureaucracy, right? The people who work in the State Department, who believe this stuff, the intelligence, the political appointees.
And Trump is more of like a Gorbachev and Reagan. He would want to have more of a Gorbachev and Reagan, maybe.
I mean, we don't really know. I mean, that's what he says. I mean, when he came into office, though, his policies were a lot of sanctions on Iran in the last administration to try and bring them to the table, and it didn't work. So would he try the same thing again if he was, with Trump? Who knows? But.
And while we're on this subject, actually, let me get your assessment of the media coverage, which people on the left, like their assessment of the Biden administration, people on the left will say that the media is totally coasting over nuance when it comes to Nasrallah and how people react to Nasrallah in the Arab world. And on the right, it's like people will say the media is being wildly too friendly to Nasrallah and describing him in different, almost positive words, perhaps in their obituaries. So how do you assess the media's coverage of what's happened just over the last couple of days, particularly in relationship to Hezbollah and Nasrallah?
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of the media don't realize that Hezbollah is an ardent enemy of the United States as well as Israel. But
really?
I don't. But look, he's a bad guy. I mean, you can debate whether the concerns over escalation, but mourning his demise or Hezbollah's, the costs have been imposed upon them with actually pretty limited civilian casualties as compared to Gaza, for example. I think is, that's impressive. The Israelis have been able to do that, and it's good riddance.
And the media sort of, its focus is on the belligerence or provocation angle rather than this guy was a long-standing threat to the United States.
Yes, and I think the concern of escalation, right? I mean, I think a lot of the media in the kind of foreign policy world is very closely, identifies with the foreign policy views of the Biden administration, and they're very concerned about escalation as a sort of be-all and end-all, and so that shapes, I think, a lot of media coverage surrounding Hezbollah.
And finally, Tom, speaking of Hezbollah, their ability to reconstitute after these very successful attacks on their leadership hierarchy. I have to get your thoughts on this because something that's also not gotten a ton of media coverage, but sort of from the other direction. CNN had a great investigation in August about this, but how Hamas has already reconstituted itself in places like Jabalia and has basically, really come back into force in a short order because you can speak to this, the ideology doesn't go away. And in some cases, there are credible concerns that the ideology hardens and escalates in and of itself. So if we turn the focus to Hezbollah, what potential is there for Hezbollah to come back in a way that can be even stronger, more robust, because if civilians in this buffer zone operation are targeted en masse, we don't know obviously what's going to happen, but if that were to happen, what could we see from Hezbollah in the near term and long term?
Well, they will reconstitute. There's no question of that. Whether they reconstitute stronger rather than weaker, I think is open to, it requires, they would need a lot of Iranian financial support, which would be, they would need political space to regenerate without Israeli military pressure. I think Hamas is going to, consistently regenerate because of, the fact that they have the Islamist grievance about Israel existing and the situation in Gaza. Yeah, and so that's that's going to be a perpetual thing, and the Israelis still haven't achieved. Hamas is still a functioning entity, but Hezbollah I think really faces a big challenge at the moment. Domestically, unpopular in a lot of quarters increasingly. Iran is obviously hesitant about providing them more support. So if they are to reconstitute, it'll take time. But they're not going to go away. But the question is, could this be a really seismic blow to them as an organization? I think it could be.
Yeah, it sounds like you're leaning towards yes.
Well, I mean, they 10, 20 years from now, I think they're still going to be, a functioning entity. The question is whether they're clearly going to be a lot more cautious about where they buy their pages from. But the ability to operate as they once did. I mean, we'll see. Maybe, but maybe not.
The thing with the buffer zone that I'm not an expert in the space, but for me, I would say is this closer to peace, where you now have you've established a new buffer zone that the people in northern Israel are utterly reliant on, and none of the kind of deep-held fundamental differences are at all healed. If anything, they're exacerbated. I guess it's just the sort of peace issue, the long-term peace issue, doesn't seem to be dramatically affected by the question of a buffer zone, even if it's justified.
Yeah, well, there's never going to be peace between Israel and Hezbollah unless,
But Lebanon's another question.
Yeah, the Iranian regime changes. Yeah, but Hezbollah's ability to affect Lebanese political decisions is a big open question. I mean, how weakened are they in that space? They seem to be pretty strong at the moment in terms of they haven't, the Lebanese army is still sort of broadly, supporting them out of the wreckage rather than taking them on directly. So, yeah, and I think the Israelis know that. The Israelis are not looking for peace here. They're looking for a military change in the status quo where they can return their citizens to the north. And the Israelis, I don't think, particularly care about peace with Hezbollah because of the impracticalities as they would see it with that, and the fact that everything in their mind, I think quite legitimately flows from Iran. The question is, where Israel would be quite happy to, I think, have a major war with the United States to take on Iran. Obviously, the United States wouldn't want that because of the costs and instability it would cause. So, the Israelis are doing what they can do in their backyard. And there are also the Israeli domestic politics here. Netanyahu is politically weak and he's clearly strengthening in the polls.
Could be a big win on the one-year anniversary of October 7th.
Yeah, and the last 2 weeks have been huge wins for him. And, he's fingers crossed that Trump comes in because he had a better relationship with Trump clearly than he has with Biden. But what is the impact in terms of the Democratic Party and some, younger Republicans in terms of the traditional close relationship with Israel? Is that, has Netanyahu jeopardized that? There are a lot of open questions here that might shape the, the next 4 years and beyond.
Netanyahu and his allies domestically in Israel must look at the Biden administration with very little respect at this point.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think but they still rely very heavily on the United States for arms supplies and things. And I think they also think things could be worse, right? The administration could have, cut off arms in a way that the UK has done, certain arms,
They keep getting what they want.
Yeah, well, and also there is a jeopardy, and Israeli foreign ministry, etc. People on the center or center left, are concerned that Netanyahu has burned bridges with the Democratic Party in a way that's not going to be, because at some point there's going to be a Democratic president, whether it's on January 20th, next year or, 4 years. Those political wounds, are a deep concern because the fundamental basis of Israel's security strategy has traditionally been focused or centered in close relationships with both Democrats and Republicans. And certainly on the Democratic Party, I think that has been jeopardized.
Tom Rogan, thank you so much for breaking all of this down.
Thank you.
Well, this story is obviously developing on a moment-by-moment basis, so it was fantastic to have Tom here. Again, you can read him, you can follow his work over at the Washington Examiner. He's so well-sourced in this space, so it was great to have Tom here to break down the details and think about what could happen in the immediate future, but also the long-term future. So if you want to get longer versions of these interviews, go ahead, subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for all of the premium benefits. Undercurrents.tv. It helps support the show. And of course, you can support the show by subscribing here on the Undercurrents YouTube channel. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We put podcast editions out every single day. If you're one of those audio people like I am, make sure to go ahead and subscribe wherever you download those podcasts and here to the Undercurrents YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for your support. We will be back here with coverage of the vice presidential debate, so stay tuned for that. Robbie Suave will join us again.